Finding an affordable rental in a good neighborhood felt like a dream come true, until a night of heavy rain revealed that I wasn't the only one who considered the house a home. Moving into my own place was supposed to be a major milestone in my life, a step toward independence and peace. After months of searching, I finally found a small, older house in a quiet, established neighborhood. The rent was surprisingly cheap, which should have been my first red flag, but I was so eager to have my own space that I ignored my intuition. The house was charming in a faded way, with creaky hardwood floors and a layout that felt cozy rather than cramped. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I spent my time unpacking boxes, arranging my furniture, and getting used to the settling sounds of an older structure. I worked a standard 9-to-5 job, and coming home to my own quiet sanctuary was the highlight of my day. One Friday night, a massive storm rolled through the area. It was the kind of rain that felt relentless, drumming against the roof and lashing the windows with such force that it drowned out every other sound. I was downstairs in the living room, curled up on the sofa with a book, enjoying the atmosphere. The power flickered a few times but stayed on, casting a warm glow over the room. However, as the night progressed, I started to feel an inexplicable sense of unease. It was that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling that you are being watched even when you are certain you are alone. I tried to dismiss it as a side effect of the storm and the isolation of the house, but the feeling only intensified as the clock ticked past midnight. I decided to head upstairs to get ready for bed, hoping that sleep would settle my nerves. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something odd. The door to my bedroom, which I specifically remembered leaving open to let the air circulate, was now pulled shut. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my heart rate beginning to climb. I told myself it must have been a draft from the storm or perhaps the house settling unevenly, but the air in the hallway felt completely still and heavy. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling slightly, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, exactly as I had left it. I checked the closet and under the bed, feeling foolish for my paranoia, and eventually managed to convince myself that I was just overreacting to the weather. I climbed into bed and turned off the lamp, letting the rhythmic sound of the rain lull me toward sleep. I drifted off for what felt like only a few minutes before I was jolted awake by a distinct sound. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was the sound of a light switch being toggled. I looked toward the hallway, and through the crack under my bedroom door, I saw a sliver of yellow light. The hallway light, which I had definitely turned off before going into my room, was now shining brightly. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, staring at that thin line of light. I didn't hear any footsteps or any movement, just the oppressive sound of the storm outside. After several minutes of agonizing silence, I forced myself to get out of bed. I grabbed a heavy glass lamp from my nightstand to use as a weapon and crept toward the door. I threw it open, expecting to find an intruder standing there, but the hallway was completely empty. The light was indeed on, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. I turned it off, my breathing shallow and ragged, and retreated back into my room, locking the door this time. I sat on the edge of my bed for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. Just as the first hints of gray light began to filter through the rain-streaked windows, I heard it again, the unmistakable click of the light switch. I looked down at the floor, and once again, the sliver of light appeared under my door. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom, inches away from me, and they were playing with the light. I realized then that the house wasn't the sanctuary I thought it was. There was someone else inside with me, someone who knew the layout of the house as well as I did, and they weren't interested in being seen. Yet, the safety I had felt in my new home vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that I had been sharing my space with a stranger since the moment I moved in. The realization that someone was standing just inches away from me, playing with the hallway light switch, turned my temporary fear into a permanent state of survival. I remained frozen on the edge of my bed, my eyes locked on the thin line of yellow light spilling into my room. The storm outside continued to rage, the thunder shaking the very foundations of the house, but all I could focus on was the rhythmic, silent movement of that switch. Every time the light flickered on, it felt like a direct challenge to my presence in the house. I was terrified to move, fearing that even the slightest creak of the floorboards would alert the intruder to my exact position, yet I knew I couldn't stay trapped in that room forever. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the light finally stayed off. I waited for over an hour, straining my ears to hear any sound of retreating footsteps or the opening of a door, but the house remained quiet beneath the roar of the rain. Eventually, driven by a mixture of desperation and a need for answers, I decided to conduct a thorough search of the second floor. I held my heavy lamp like a club and slowly unlocked my bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black and smelled faintly of damp wood and old dust. I moved from room to room, turning on every single light as I went, desperate to banish the shadows where someone could be hiding. I checked the guest room, the bathroom, and the small office space, but found no one. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it, which only made the situation more terrifying. If no one was in the rooms, then where had they gone so quickly after flickering the light? That was when I noticed the small, rectangular wooden panel in the ceiling at the far end of the hallway. It was the access hatch to the attic, a space I hadn't even bothered to look at since moving in. As I stared up at it, I noticed a faint smudge of dark, wet mud on the white trim of the hatch. My heart sank. Someone had been up there, watching me through the vents or waiting for me to lower my guard. I stood beneath the hatch for a long time, debating whether to pull the string and reveal what was hidden above. The thought of a stranger crouching in the dark insulation, listening to my every move, made my skin crawl. Just as I reached up to grab the cord, a heavy, muffled thud echoed from directly above my head. It was the unmistakable sound of a body shifting weight on the wooden joists. I backed away slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a prankster or a glitch in the wiring. I was sharing a roof with someone who had been living in the shadows of my home, perhaps since the day I signed the lease. I decided that I couldn't stay in the house a moment longer. I retreated to my bedroom to grab my phone and my shoes, but as I reached for my jacket, I heard a new sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was the sound of the attic hatch slowly creaking open. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming down. I lunged for my bedroom door and slammed it shut, turning the lock just as I heard the heavy hit of feet landing on the hallway floor outside. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving toward my door with a terrifying lack of urgency. The person on the other side didn't try to turn the handle or break the door down. Instead, they stood perfectly still, their presence a heavy weight against the wood. Then, I heard a low, raspy chuckle that sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. It was a sound of recognition, as if they had been enjoying the terror they were causing. I realized then that the cheap rent and the quiet neighborhood were just the bait for a much darker trap. I was trapped on the second floor with a predator who knew every inch of the house, and the storm outside was loud enough to ensure that no one would hear me if I screamed for help. The presence of the man outside my bedroom door made the air in the small room feel like it was disappearing. I was trapped between the locked door and the rain-slicked window, with nowhere left to hide in a house that I had thought was mine. The raspy chuckle that had echoed through the wood was not just a sound. It was an admission that he had been watching me, learning my patterns and waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his presence. I stood in the center of the room, my hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped my phone as I struggled to dial the emergency number. I kept my eyes fixed on the door handle, expecting it to turn at any second, but the man outside remained perfectly still, as if he were enjoying the sound of my panicked breathing. The heavy rain outside continued to drum against the roof, but it could no longer hide the smaller, more terrifying sounds coming from the hallway. I heard the soft rustle of clothing and a faint, rhythmic scratching against the door frame. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I realized that staying in the bedroom was no longer an option if he decided to force his way in. I moved toward the window, thinking I might have to jump into the muddy yard below, but just as I reached for the latch, the scratching stopped. I turned back toward the door and saw that it was cracking open slightly. I hadn't heard the lock turn, and I realized with a jolt of horror that the old wood was warping under the pressure he was applying, or perhaps he had found a way to bypass the simple lock long ago. Through the narrow gap between the door and the frame, I saw a single eye looking back at me. It was wide, bloodshot, and filled with a disturbing level of intensity. We made eye contact for a split second, a moment that felt like it lasted an hour, before the man realized he had been caught. Instead of retreating, he shoved the door open with a sudden burst of strength and stepped into my bedroom. He didn't run at me or attempt to attack immediately. Instead, he began walking toward me with a slow, predatory gait. He was unkempt, his hair matted and his clothes covered in dust from the attic, but he was wearing a wide, distorted smile that looked completely out of place on his haggard face. He started trying to explain himself, murmuring nonsense about how he had been there all along and that I shouldn't be afraid, but the way he approached made it clear he didn't intend to let me leave. I didn't stay to hear the rest of his rambling. In a surge of pure adrenaline, I lunged past him, using the surprise of my sudden movement to get through the doorway and into the dark hallway. I didn't look back to see if he was chasing me. I flew down the stairs, my feet barely touching the hardwood, and sprinted toward the front door. I burst out into the torrential rain, the cold water soaking through my clothes instantly. But I didn't stop until I was across the street and standing under the dim glow of a neighbor's porch light. I was screaming for help, my voice cracking against the roar of the storm, as I finally managed to get through to the police dispatcher. As I stood there in the rain, shivering and watching my front door, I saw a shadow emerge from the house. The man ran out into the night, his dark figure blurring against the sheets of rain as he disappeared down the road before the authorities could arrive. When the police finally made it to the scene, they conducted a thorough investigation of the property. They found that the back door had been bashed in, the handle and the lock shattered and useless. I had never noticed the damage because I never used that entrance, meaning he could have been entering and exiting the house for weeks without my knowledge. What haunts me the most is the state he was in when he stepped out of the shadows of my bedroom. He wasn't dripping wet, he was dry. This meant he had been inside my house for the entire night, hiding in the attic or the closets while I was downstairs reading and relaxing. He had been there in the silence, watching and waiting. To this day, I don't know why he chose to break in or what his ultimate goal was, and the mystery of why he kept playing with the hallway light switch still keeps me awake at night. I moved out of that house the following week and never looked back, but I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in that quiet neighborhood, another cheap rental is waiting for someone else to move in, while a stranger waits in the dark above their head.